Hello, good evening dear students. I am Dr. Tarlochal Kaur Sandhu, Assistant Professor in English from Government VYT PG Autonomous College Durg, affiliated to Hemchand Yadav University. My dear students, I welcome you in today's video lecture session, and this video lecture I have specially prepared for the students of MA English Semester 2, and the topic which I have taken is from paper 5 Modernist Poetry, Unit 1, W.B. Yeats, The Second Coming. Initially I will be giving you a short introduction of the poet W.B. Yeats, and thereafter I will be discussing with you the Second Coming's major features, and I'll do a critical analysis along with some explanatory notes, and at the end of the lecture I have given you some questions for your preparation. So students, let us begin with a brief introduction of the poet William Butler Yeats. W.B. Yeats was born in Ireland on 13th June 1865 and is one of the greatest English poets of the 20th century, who influenced his contemporaries and successors T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound and W.H. Auden. He studied at various regular and art schools in England and in Ireland, but was not bright enough to go for higher education. In 1886, he turned a professional writer, and in 1889 published his first volume of poems, The Wanderings of Oisin and Other Poems. In the same year, he fell in love with Maud Gonne, an actress and revolutionary, who married John McBride. After long years of agony, he married Georgie Heidi Lees. In 1899, he founded Irish National Theatre with Lady Gregory. In 1922, he became the Senator of the Irish Free State. In 1923, he won the Nobel Prize for Literature and died on 28th January 1939. The three most common themes in Yeats' poetry are love, Irish nationalism, and mysticism. Modern poetry was written especially for intellectuals, and the new poets took pain to provide a new form and structure opposing the vagueness and extravagance of sentiment in Georgian poetry. Overall changes in the 19th century, like different romantic classic forms and less focus on love lone and rather on harsh reality, was seen in the poetry of the emerging poets. Imagination was replaced by realism. Modern poetry thereby is innovative, experimental, and difficult. Modernism is the overriding theme in Yeats' writings. Yeats started his career as a romantic poet and evolved into a modernist poet. He is regarded as a seed in modernism. He shifted his focus from Irish folklore to contemporary politics. As a modernist, he experimented with verse forms, wrote about politics, shifted away from conventions and traditions, as well as rejected the notion that poetry should always be lyrical and beautiful. These influences caused his poetry to become more darker and more concise. Yeats was a prolific writer, and his poetic career extends over a period of about 50 years. And by common consent, Yeats' great poetry is considered to be the result of the consummation of a long and fruitful poetic career. There is no sudden break or change in his growth as a poet, and his poetic style reflects a gradual evolution. His critics have discussed the development of his poetry under four heads, and mostly it is said that the poetic genius of the poet was attained to its maturity by passing through four phases of development. During the first phase, that began in 1885 and lasted till 1899, he is a romantic in search of word music and word pictures. He echoes Shelley, Spenser, and the pre-Raphaelites. He also sings of his personal love, especially his love for Maud Gonne. During the second phase, that began in 1900 and lasted till 1915, he is a realist, a lyricist, and his love-lone yearning for his lost love is reflected in his poems. At the same time, he also has bitter experiences of Irish nationalism, Irish politics, and Irish theatre, and his poetry sheds all decoration. Moreover, it is filled with passion and even satire. During the third phase, that is from 1916 till 1933, his poetic genius gradually attains to maturity. His imagination becomes mythopoeic and verses musical and rich in imagery from all the corners of the world. Yeats also employs symbolism in the poems of The Tower and The Winding Stair. And as far as the last phase is concerned, that began in 1934 and lasted till 1939, that is till his death, he became a master of personal symbolism and wrote striking phrases, obscure images, but spontaneous rhythms and capturing word music. He uses proper names as symbols for abstract ideas, but the grouping together of such proper names shocks his readers, and sometimes the serious poetry of a great symbolist poet like him is at a time smiling at the ignorance of his critics. The images are so living and natural that the abstraction vanishes into them so completely that one wonders how it had ever seemed obscure. And yet, in gaining clarity, it loses nothing of its depth. Yeats abandoned the conventional poetic diction of his early work in favor of unadorned language, verbal economy, and more direct approach to his themes and subjects. His critical attitude made him one of the most acclaimed modernists, and as a modernist poet, Yeats regrets for postmodern world which is now in disorder and chaos. The Second Coming is a superb example of Yeats' modernism, as in this poem he portrays a modern chaotic and disordered condition after the First World War, and the poet tends to be prophetic. Now, students, let us discuss some of the salient features of the poem, The Second Coming, and thereafter I will be giving you a critical estimate of the poem. The Second Coming was published in an American magazine, The Dial, in 1920, though it was composed by the poet in 1919, a month before the composition of A Prayer for My Daughter. Then it was published in Yeats' poetic volume entitled Michael Robarts and the Dancer in 1921. The poet got inspiration from the Easter Uprising of 1916, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, the Irish Civil War of 1919, and the First World War. The poem has to be studied against the background of Yeats' philosophy that civilizations move in cycles. Two European civilizations have appeared and disappeared. The span of each civilization is of 2000 years. The first was the Greco-Roman civilization before the birth of Christ, and the second is from the birth of Christ to the present day. The Second Coming is probably the most powerful poem in Yeats' poetry. It treats of a belief that the modern Christian civilization has traveled far, far away from its starting point and is breathing its last. The second incarnation is at hand, but probably it is not the second coming of Christ, but a bestial civilization is in the offing. As far as the title is concerned, it alludes to two sources from the Bible. The Gospel of St. Matthew 24, in which Christ speaks about his second coming, and the Revelations in which St. John envisions the coming of the beast of the Apocalypse. The meaning of the Apocalypse is a disaster or the complete final destruction of the world. Yeats, as a visionary, could have sensed the coming of further wars, violence, bloodshed, especially in the World War II, that would possibly change the world. He knew that the world would never remain the same after the 20th century. Now, let us read the poem. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming, hardly are those words out, when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born? As far as the poetic thought is concerned, the opening of the poem gives us an impression that the poet is in the midst of a thought. He is thinking of how the place of one civilization is taken by another. He speculates how the present Christian civilization has drifted far away from its central code of love and non-violence and has given way to a civilization of hatred and violence. The falcon, flying round and round along its ever-widening gyre. Gyre refers to a spiral or circular motion. In circular course in the sky, cannot always hear the falconer and is out of control. At one point, the link between the two is broken. The falconer, as the controller at the center, cannot keep his control over the falcon. In a very similar way, when a civilization has moved far, far away from its starting point, it is out of control of its central code and its scriptures. The people of the world become absolutely free from the restraints of morality, discipline, and religion. Man's intelligence is dimmed by sensuality and his animal passions are on the loose. Innocence and courtesy are gone and the bloody tide of violence rolls all around. The best minds have become skeptical of their beliefs in the values of life, and the worst are full of animal passions to take possession of the world. The poet implies that the state of present day Christian civilization is the same, and it is indicative of the emergence of a new civilization of violence and animal or carnal passions. In the second part or the second stanza, the poet describes his vision of a divine revelation while contemplating on the present state of affairs. He sits thinking of how the present civilization has put on the cult of violence and animal passions, and in the foregoing lines he tells himself that the second coming, that is incarnation, is undoubtedly quite near. The moment the poet utters these words, a vision flashes across his mind. He notices a huge figure, a beast with a lion's body and a man's head, much like the Sphinx, spring from the storehouse of images. The hovering darkness and the flight of the angry birds suggest the advent of a savage and cruel civilization. The strange beast slouches towards Bethlehem, and the gaze of this beast is emotionless and pitiless as that of the sun, and is moving slowly on the sands of the desert. The poet, by virtue of this vision, reveals a secret that for 20 centuries the second incarnation was made to petrifying sleep, but now its sleep has been rocked or disturbed in its cradle to its indignation. So, this second incarnation will signify the beginning of a savage civilization full of violence, bloodshed, rudeness, and animal instincts. And now, students, let us talk about the poetic feeling and the use of imagery. Poetic feeling is a genuine and sincere emotion born of a thought. And in this poem, we find that Yeats' feelings are intensified by a vision of a mysterious nature. Finally, it is rounded up with the prophecy of the second coming. Whether we believe it to be true or not, we cannot disown the image of the present day world. According to Yeats, man's mind is ruled by blood, that is sensuality, and courtesy, and innocence are no more. The best are skeptical of the values of life, and the worst are slaves to animal passions. The imagery of the poem is fresh and striking. The poem, as we know, opens with the image of a flying falcon, and the falconer stands on earth and is unable to control it. Then follows the image of anarchy upon the world, and the next moment we see a tide both dimmed by and full of blood. And then springs the image of the beast from Spiritus Mundi, which slouches towards Bethlehem. And in the second stanza, we see three images: the huge beast, the sands of the desert, and shadows of indignant desert birds. The idea they combinedly suggest is that of a savage state of nature ruled by beasts and birds of prey. The beast has a man's head, which implies the advent of bestial civilization. The images stand in relation to one another and represent a scene from the desert. The scene is marked by compression and complexity, and it is by such compression and complexity that Yeats attains in his great poems the simplicity of fire that he saw in the beauty of Maud Gonne. Now, in fact, the three images are symbols of a coming civilization. The desert suggests that the cities of the present civilization will be turned into parts of a sandy desert. The beastly figure suggests that man will be half man, half beast. And the flight of the indignant bird suggests that even birds will be thirsty of man's blood and hover over him to eat his flesh. On the whole, the three images unitedly represent a scene of a savage civilization situated in the desert. The poet seems to warn us of the coming of this civilization in near future. In effect, the symbolism represents the terror of a coming savage civilization. Now, the meter and about the rhythm of the poem. The lines have been composed in blank verse and they are of uneven lengths. The poem has two parts of 8 and 14 lines each, and most of them are iambic pentameters. There are extra syllables here and there at the end of a line. The texture of many verses has been characterized by half rhymes. Now, the poem, as I told you, has the element of drama, which is introduced at the beginning of the second stanza, and a divine revelation that occurs to the poet is as though in a reverie. By virtue of the dominance of a personal emotion, the poem becomes a fine lyric. It has been made powerful by the element of drama, that is conflict between the opposite, thought and feeling, past and present, real and imaginary, that is reality and a vision. The diction of the poem is simple, urban and literary, yet some symbolical phrases like the blood-dimmed tide, the ceremony of innocence, and other are vague because they are loaded with symbolist ideas. The style of the poem is modern with an undercurrent of romanticism, and overall, the idea of the poem is a highly complex one with a chain of infinite links, so the style may be called modern romantic style. So, students, I hope you have understood the poem, and for your comprehension and understanding, I have given you some questions which you may discuss and prepare for your exams. The questions are here. Write a critical appreciation of the Second Coming by W.B. Yeats. And the question number 2 is, discuss W.B. Yeats as a